Welcome back to Second Breakfast and our, for now, ongoing coverage of A Game of Thrones, bringing you the best thoughts, theories, and literary analysis this side of Peter Baelish's School of French Kissing.
Ew, I really didn't like that description.
Yeah.
It grossed me out. Can you imagine? This kid's like 9 years old trying to tongue his favorite girls.
Yeah, he's going to town on two of them.
Like, disgusting. Imagine, like, playing tee-hee, kiss, and then, like, this 9-year-old boy goes, ugh.
Precocious, sure.
Disgusting. He's always been a creep.
So we're talking about Catelyn chapter 11. This is actually the second to last chapter of A Game of Thrones.
Wow.
We've made it all the way here. It's been like a year and a half to get here.
Don't jinx it. What if we, died before? I don't know, we died before the last chapter.
If we die, this episode should perform pretty well.
It actually probably will. You're very right.
I'm going to go out on the French kissing joke.
Speaking of performing well, did you guys know that Cam's latest book, Lemon Tarts in Space, is available for purchase? It's a light sci-fi dark comedy rip-roaring ride through space and time. You can read it as a paperback or an ebook format novel, or you can listen to the fully produced audio drama. The link is in the description below.
Ridley Scott's Alien by way of Monty Python.
Yes, it's
Thank you very
fun.
much.
Yes, anyway, so
yeah, we're talking about Catelyn chapter 11. As a little reminder, if you haven't listened to the last few episodes, what the fuck have you been doing?
What a weird place to join.
But next week, of course, will be the final chapter of this book with the final Dany chapter, and then we will do our traditional retrospective where we go back through all of our big-ass theories and thoughts and, the whole thing.
It's a moment of reflection.
Yes,
it's always fun.
I really like doing those. They're really tough to prepare. We're doing that afterwards, and then we will move on into the great unknown. We will still cover this series, but in a different way and not week to week.
Yes, we've loved the chapter by chapter every week. It's been like the structure of the show since we started 5 years ago.
Yep.
Wild to say that. But we're excited to try something new. So anyway, we're still going to cover Clash of Kings, etc. So please stay tuned. But just things are changing a little bit.
Right.
Which brings me to my recap of this chapter, because what I want to talk about in this chapter is a lot about change. But we'll get there. First, let me give you all a recap of what happened.
Spoilers for everything in the book and the show.
Absolutely. Again, weird for you to join here if you don't know that. But
Episode 495.
Incredible. What is like volume 72 of
something like that?
Something like that. Also, I want y'all to know, I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a cold, and my cough is so weird that now it just sounds like I'm scoffing. Like it sounds like I'm being an asshole. So if I say that's just me coughing. So sorry. But okay.
If I ever sound annoying, it's also my illness.
That makes it worse. Okay, anyway.
Oh, you're scoffing.
That's me. Okay, so Catelyn, Robb, and co. have arrived at River Run. It's post-battle. Remember, they've captured Jaime. They're at River Run. They're heading inside. Catelyn goes to visit her father at last. We've heard lots of rumors throughout this whole book that her father is ill, not doing well. Turns out he's really not doing well. He is dying. He's on his deathbed. And they hadn't let that information out because they didn't want, the Lannisters to think that the Tullys were weak or didn't have a leader. So Catelyn didn't know how bad it was, but she gets to go see him, so that's really great for her. They have a good conversation.
Sort of.
I mean, yeah, no, I'm glad she gets to see him, what I'm saying. Like, she gets to see him, but he's gonna die. And so then she goes to talk to Robb and say, hey, Robb, you should go see your grandfather because he's dying. And he says, I would love to do that, but first I need to meet with everybody because we just got word that Renly Baratheon has declared himself king. So that puts a real wrench in things. So we have to meet right now.
Robb's in the Godswood, sort of grieving the news about Ned.
Yes, right. Yeah, this is our first. I think this is our. Is this our first Catelyn chapter post Ned, or have we already? See, I'm scoffing. Have we already gotten it? I can't remember. I mean, they're thinking about Ned and they're sad and they're reflecting on it.
Ned has died many times.
Yes.
This might be the last time he dies. This book, unless Dany is suddenly very affectionate.
Suddenly she's
Eddard
missing
Stark.
Eddard. Yeah. Anyway, So Robb goes to convene with everybody, and this conversation and really this argument lasts for hours. There are all these disagreements about what the next move is. Do they back Renly and because Lannisters are the worst and Joffrey might be a bastard anyway. So maybe I'm telling you. So maybe it's because it's the end of the day.
No, I know.
I made it this far. Anyway, so should we back them? But at the same time, if we fight for Renly and Joffrey and the Lannisters win, then we'll be traitors. So maybe that's bad. And also, does Renly even have the right? Because what about Stannis? There's all this conversation back and forth.
Robb points out that if he is to be a man of principle and morally consistent, in the same way Bran can't be Lord of Winterfell because Robb is older than him and still alive, he thinks it would technically, even though his father was beheaded by Joffrey, it would be traitorous to support Renly when he didn't have the right because Stannis would.
Exactly. And Robb stays pretty quiet for most of the conversation for a long time. Catelyn sort of notes that's the same kind of thing that Ned used to do. But he does point that out. He's like, but also, I don't really know what to do. He says that he prayed to the gods for advice and they did not answer. And so they're going back and forth. Catelyn speaks up finally. She's also been listening, and she says that they should try for peace. She says that more war would be futile, and like there's just no point. Like what? So more and more people are gonna die. Like we didn't win Ned. They didn't pull him out of prison. They killed him. So like that effort is gone. Maybe we should just like try to go for peace instead. And she almost has them won over, almost. But then these guys pipe up and they're like, "What did we all fight and die for? Only for things to go back to how they were. Like, what is the point of that? Like, that doesn't make any sense."
They also dismiss her because she's a woman.
Yeah, they're like, "You have a woman's weak heart and you want peace," all the regular shit. And she like holds her own and gives a great response, but still that's a lot of these guys' mentality. And then the Great John lurches to his feet, and I was gonna look up who the Great John is because I can't remember. Is that what it is?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, he's one of these, important lords of the North.
He's one of the big dudes who it was formative. It was an important moment when he bent the knee to Robb and accepted him as his lord.
Yes. And so he stands up finally and he goes, "My lords," all caps. And it says, "My lords," he shouted, his voice booming off the rafters. "Here is what I say to these two kings," meaning Renly and Joffrey. It says, he spat. "Renly Baratheon is nothing to me, nor Stannis neither. Why should they rule over me and mine, from some flowery seat in high garden or Dorne? What do they know of the wall, or the wolfswood, or the barrows of the first men? Even their gods are wrong. Why shouldn't we rule ourselves again? It was the dragons we married, and the dragons are all dead." He pointed at Robb with the blade. "There sits the only king I mean to bow my knee to, my lords," he thundered, "the king in the north."
And then they all chant "King in the North."
Then they all,
how it ends. Yeah.
Yes, it's a beautiful, exciting, memorable moment, and that's where we leave it.
Yeah, beautiful. I think this is a great send-off for, most of the cast. Dany's always been on her own, so next week is a finale to that storyline and the book. But so much of this story and this novel has been about the Starks, the Lannisters, the Baratheons, that sort of mess spiraling in and around King's Landing. So this is the finale to that story. And if we have all of these kings coming out of nowhere, we don't really know Stannis or Renly yet. We knew Renly a little bit. He was kind of a shit when Ned was in charge.
We barely met him. We didn't get to know him well at all.
But this elevation of Robb, this means something for us. This does feel like a finale for the majority of the story. But I think it represents a different sort of finale as well. Because we're almost done with the book, I've been thinking about the retrospective we're going to do. And one of the big theories that we've been talking about week in, week out for over a year now is what we were calling the central conflict of this series, which is the living versus the dead. And I think this chapter represents the climax of that central conflict. Not in fantastical terms, in the way we have been talking about lately within Jon's storyline, because he's been fighting White Walkers, and they have become there are analogs for the dead. They've been the mascots for the dead, and everyone else has been the living. But I think the conflict is represented in this chapter more practically. It's more about boots on the ground, where Catelyn is arguing, she's imploring this war council to sue for peace and return home. And of course, in response, she's dismissed, she's souted down, she's dismissed because of her gender, the gentler sex, all that shit.
Yeah.
And she's basically overruled in favor of grievance. Other people have killed people I care about, so I have to go kill them. And we know from every other chapter in the book that cycle never ends. So my question here, and I will throw it to you before I explain what I think is my answer to it, but to throw it to you, if we're resolving that central conflict of the living versus the dead in this chapter, who wins? Who wins in this chapter?
You mean the living versus the dead? Who wins? Seems like the dead.
That's my hunch too.
Just because if the answer to all of this is to continue to fight and seek vengeance and stuff for the people who have died, more people are going to die. And so, and maybe that's not fair because, I wouldn't say Ned Stark is winning here, even though he is dead. So it's not really about the the dead people as individuals, but maybe more like as a whole. Like death is winning here. Like not the individual dead people,
Sure.
but death versus life, death is winning
Yes,
here.
and we are, of course, abstracting these concepts a little bit to have any sort of discussion about it, but the moral, if there is one, that I took away from this chapter, maybe the recurring theme is a better way to put it, is two wrongs don't make a right. That's
Right.
basically what Catelyn's arguing.
Yeah,
She's
yeah.
saying an eye for an eye, which they're viewing as, hey, this is justice, and she says an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. It's
Yes,
those
yes.
kind of bumper sticker aphorisms, but those are resonant for a reason, because they are accessible and they pop up again and again. And I'm reminded of the conversation we had during the last few Tyrion chapters, when he's with Tywin. And so much of that is also war councils and planning, and it comes down to cycles of violence and grievance and resentment, and that those just continue. To paraphrase Dany, the wheel turns and turns, and we know where this goes until 2 kings have now declared for the throne, and then it'll be 3, and then it'll be 4, and the Clash of Kings will eventually be 5.
Right.
And then, of course, heads will start to roll, especially through that 3rd book, and we'll kill off, a third of our central cast. So I'm on the same page here that the dead are winning. At least in this book, the dead have won, and I could probably make that argument for all 5 published books.
Well, I was going to say, because then you extend it to the White Walkers. Like, then that's truly the dead, and they're the ones who we have to end up fighting in the end. So I like that as like the growing enemy in a metaphorical way, and then it becomes literal towards the end of the story.
And that's the caveat, because we don't know how that conflict will end in the books.
Right.
We don't have some of those characters, and I can't imagine some of it playing out that way.
But we do know that this conflict is like sort of the growing, that's the looming threat
Right.
from the prologue of this book, right?
And
so that's where we're headed.
Yes, exactly. And I
Regardless of how it ends up.
something slippery is happening here, because we've had these clean delineations between the living and the dead. It's fairly binary the way we usually talk about it.
Unless you're Arya.
But that's the thing. I think we're starting to get characters who cross over. So, like, Ned Stark was of the living, and he was trying to argue for peace and rationality and all these other ideals that got him beheaded. Just the fact that he is dead now doesn't make him necessarily a mascot for death and those worldviews that we're talking about.
Yeah.
But we are seeing some of these characters embittered and jaded and changing their tune. And their worldview is shifting before our eyes. We're seeing them start to prioritize vengeance and espouse the benefits of the cycle of violence and all of these reciprocal deaths versus shooting for any kind of life. And I think the mascot for that kind of evolving worldview, hopping the fence between the living and the dead, is Robb Stark. And that's kind of the tragedy, I think, of this chapter. Catelyn makes this point where she says, yes, I know eventually he's going to be married to one of Walder Frey's weird-looking daughters, but I think he's really married to the sword he just plonked down on the table.
I loved that line. It was so nice.
And at the beginning of the chapter, she's remembering him as a little boy. And he's positioned as an incredibly youthful figure. Whether it's the young wolf, it's how much piss and vinegar he has in battle. He is vivacious. He's young. He is full of life. But as he's settling into this new role, he seems darker. He seems slower, more jaded, and less hopeful. Even the idealism of his father is sort of fading as he gets this new experience in the world.
Right, because he says things that Ned would say, like, oh, well, Stannis has the right, Renly doesn't, that kind of thing. But then he says, like, but I don't know what to do. Like, he's even questioning, because, like, Ned would have been like, well, we have to back Stannis. I mean, that's what he said before he was killed for it, right? So, but we see Robb changing his tune there and questioning and evolving.
That's where I enjoyed the titles, the new title that we gave to Robb at the end of this chapter, because I'm talking about his identity evolving. His name is sort of evolving too. As we call him the King in the North, I noticed as a bunch of the guys are volleying and chanting that at him, one guy says something else, and one guy calls him the King of Winter.
I really liked that. I actually think it's a woman who calls him that, by the way.
Okay. I use guys. I'm from New England, so guys is a genderless term for me.
I was just excited
Guys
that there
is
was a
what-
lady here.
For New England, for that part of the country, guys is what y'all is for the South.
That's totally fair.
Completely genderless.
It's Mage Mormont is the one who
yes,
says it.
thank you.
Yeah.
But it reminded me, because I'm a simple boy, King in the North and the King of Winter remind me of the Night King.
Of course.
Or, as George R. R. Martin calls that, because that character isn't in the book, but it's kind of hinted at a little bit.
Yeah.
He says the Night's King. So there
Oh,
are different
nice.
kind of ways to style this name, but I was reminded of the Night King, and then instantly I was reminded of Hardhome, which is such a memorable episode from season 5, and particularly the scene where all the humans get wiped out by the White Walkers, and then they all stand up again, and they are now whites, or I've never fucking cared about that distinction.
They're
I'm going to
walkers.
say White Walkers because that's what people understand.
Yeah.
They become undead zombie people with blue eyes.
And you can't just say Walker because then you're getting into Walking Dead territory,
And
and
then
it's very confusing.
Whites sounds weird. It's like House of Cards, House of the Dragon with the blacks and the greens.
Ugh,
It's just,
yeah.
it's weird.
Yeah, because you can't. Anyway.
Anyway, all the resurrections at the end of Hardhome, where people go from being living to being undead zombies. And that is so effective because it's scary, and we all liked The Walking Dead when it was good, but it's also because it's an effective visual metaphor and kind of a shorthand for the sort of more abstract conversations you and I have all the time. It's a great visual metaphor for these cycles of violence, for this victory, ultimately, of death and the forces of death over life. So as I build up to this question, with the caveat that we always have of, I know the Night King isn't really in the books, and I know he's never really ID'd in the show, where it's like, hey, he was actually this guy from 400 years ago.
Oh,
and
sure.
He's a zombie
Because
now.
he was a person at one point.
Right.
Yeah, I see.
With those caveats, and I know I looked it up, he first appears in the show in about halfway through season 4.
Okay.
5 or so episodes
So
after the Red
Robb.
Wedding.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I'm asking this in a wishy-washy way on purpose. Kind of asking literally and kind of asking figuratively. Is Robb Stark the Night King?
It's a fun question. I think what is, I guess if you want to take it literally, we have to ask, of course the Night King isn't introduced until season 4, like you said, but where's he been before that? Has he been amassing an army? Has he been ruling over the dead in some way? If so, how far back does that have to go? And if it goes back far enough, it's not going to work if it's Robb. Number 2, how would Robb's body get beyond the wall, all that. So I think literally no, but figuratively that's really interesting, especially because then I feel like it kind of both pairs and sets him against Jon. Like Jon as being this like defender of the wall, going going beyond the wall to fight the White Walkers. He's like killed a White Walker already, like, and him being like this Lord Snow versus Winter King. I don't know. It puts them like together and also on opposite sides at the same time. And I like that because Jon is very much like Robb's Dorian Gray in that they're basically the same age. They think have the same father but different mothers, and like, Robb is the true Lord of Winterfell, the King of the North. Robb is a bastard. Jon is a bastard and has to go fight on the wall and find his own identity there. Both of them, we in our last Jon chapter last week, we talked all about Jon's shifting identity and figuring out where he lands, and you've just identified that's what Robb's doing here too. So I like that as a metaphorical thing, as Robb sort of being our Night King. And it's interesting that Arya has to, again, this is how it goes in the show, but Arya kills the Night King. And that's interesting because Arya basically sees Robb die at the Red Wedding, like almost. So like that's all interesting and circular and non-linear and fun. So I like that as an idea. Again, like I think literally it doesn't work, but I think metaphorically it's fascinating.
Yeah, and that's why I'm trying to ride the lightning there, because I'm not as interested in the literal argument. I mean, you could say because he's beheaded and they put the wolf head on him that maybe this is a different head that they put on. Anyway, you could do it that way.
Yeah,
but you're right. I am more interested in the figurative, in the abstract, because he is shifting this worldview. And I think as a mascot, he's jumping the fence here because he already feels sort of dead in that he's advocating a dead-end road. And he's making for more dead people. Like, he's part of that machine already by being married to his war, as Catelyn says. And I think the same could be said for the rest of the War Council here. For Blackfish, this guy who's kind of been stuck in this arrested development where he never really grew up. He never got married.
Yeah.
Even his father makes a whole point about that.
And being trapped at the Vale makes you just sort of isolated from the rest of the world.
Sure.
And that's really interesting.
So he's kind of already dead. And Hoster Tully's literally on his deathbed and also stuck in the past.
Yeah.
So to even abstract it from beyond Robb Stark, Catelyn is surrounded in this chapter by dead men.
Yes.
Advocating for more death. Like, this chapter is a frightening escalation of all the theories we've been making about ghost stories. I think this is the most self-defeating, self-destructive form of that worldview that we've seen so far. And now that Robb has kind of turned to the dark side with all of these other guys, it's starting to make sense to me, possibly, why Catelyn is the POV chapter, the POV character here.
Okay.
Because if she's like the only living person in the room, the way I'm formulating it here, maybe we only give POV, inroads to these living characters versus all of these kings that will destroy themselves.
That's really interesting. I think the exception is Arya, because we've talked about her as traversing this like realm between the living and the dead. But maybe it's not an exception because she does not destroy herself through that. In fact, that's what gives her strength. She sort of like overcomes that compared to somebody like Robb or Robert Baratheon or Joffrey or any of these other kings. So that's interesting.
And I think Arya, when she does kind of go to the dark side, and she is consumed as well by vengeance, and she's chanting her list of who she wants to kill, her naming convention changes too. And she kind of becomes nobody.
Yeah. She has to adapt and change her identity. Yes.
But by the end of the story, she goes back to her roots and becomes a Stark again.
Yes.
So I think
Sansa kind of does does the same thing too, because she's right now in this moment of change of, you talked about shifting worldviews. Sansa's worldview has shifted dramatically. We talked about that a lot in her last chapter, and she's like adapting a new way of existing and moving through the world. But we know, at least if it goes the way in the show, she will go back to being Lady Stark, and she will embrace that part of herself again.
It seems like POV characters are not mascots of the death side of the equation, and if they become that, they die. Because characters, after Catelyn dies, and spoilers, turns into Lady Stoneheart, she is just this undead cycle of revenge, killing people who killed her family at the Red Wedding. She's doing the same thing that I'm talking about metaphorically, Robb doing when he comes to act as the Night King, basically, already.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't think it's sustainable that we have these death representative characters as POVs.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And that is sort of a rousing statement.
It is, yeah. And it's interesting that we both have identified a lot of similar things happening in this chapter, but I've been looking at it a little differently. I'm interested in the way you're characterizing and classifying this as being about death and how you respond to that, or shift from this life to death perspective, because I was really thinking about it more as change, and you've been talking about that too, this idea of shifting identities, characters' priorities shifting, people's worldviews changing. And I think what's interesting about Catelyn here is she's sort of singled out because in this moment of change where Ned is now dead, Joffrey is now king, Renly has declared himself as king. There's all this change happening around her, but she is sort of stuck in the past in this chapter and in previous chapters that we've seen her in too. And I think this is sort of a turning point for her. My sort of central leading quote here was from, I think, Lord Karstark, where he says, "What have we fought for if we are to put it all back as it was before?" And that's when they're sort of advocating for, no, we can't have peace, we have to have war. Because Catelyn spends a lot of this chapter, like I said, remembering the past. We see her entering River Run and remembering stuff from when she was a kid. We see her thinking about kissing Peter Baelish, and we see her thinking about being in the Godswood and learning to ride a horse when she was a kid. And she's sad about all those things. She's missing all of those things. She's not like, oh, that's where I learned to ride a horse. It's like, oh, everything's changed. Because she's acknowledging the way things have shifted. She notes that the Tully banner doesn't lift her heart as it's supposed to. Her brother has a mouth made for smiles, but he was not smiling now. Her father used to be this large, impressive man, and now he's shrunken and all the strength is gone from his hands. She's seeing all the things that have changed, but instead of accepting those changes and adapting, she is trying to make things go back to the way they were. We see her lamenting, I want to have my daughters back. Robb, I want you to go back to Winterfell and grow old and have babies and rule as your father did. I want to go home. And those are, of course, understandable, valid things to want and hope for. And you understand where she's coming from. But at the same time, I'm thinking, I'm sitting here thinking, you're not playing the game that everybody else is playing. because that mentality is not going to get you anywhere. You know, doing what Ned did, which is saying, no, Stannis is the rightful heir. We should go back to that. That's the right thing to do. That's not going to work when your players are the Lannisters, when your other players are the Greyjoys and Stannis and Renly. Like, none of that is going to work
if no one else is playing by the same rules.
Exactly. And everybody else around her, even if like their mentality is very like vengeance driven, creates more death, that's bad in its own way. Regardless, that's what's going to work here. They are adapting to the changes around them. Maybe the change is an increase in death, but they're adapting to that and saying, hey, we can't go back to how things were 10 years ago. We have to go back to how things were centuries ago when we had a king in the north. And that's what we need to do. And I think this moment is sort of her realizing that. And this is like almost her goodbye to her past. She has to like lament and say goodbye to River Run as she knew it. She has to say goodbye to her father who's about to die. She has to say goodbye to Robb the boy and think about Robb the man. Like, this is that moment for her, and we actually kind of just saw Jon do that in the last chapter too. He like says a quiet goodbye in his head and an apology to Arya and Robb and Bran, and is like, you know, adapting and accepting his new identity, his new place. And I think that's what Catelyn is about to do here as well.
Even the version of Lysa that Hoster Tully is asking for on his deathbed, that person's no longer here. Because the version of Lysa we saw at the Vale is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs now.
Right.
So there is this evolution. It's graduation day.
Exactly. And so much of this chapter is about like moving on, like the old crew dying so the next generation can come in. Ned is dead and now Robb can take his place, but in a new, refreshed way. Hoster Tully is dying, and so now, you know, Edmure, her brother, is going to take over in a new way. You know, Robert Baratheon's dead and now Joffrey's here. So like it's like new generation, new blood, new ideas, like change is happening and it's time to move forward. And that's what we're seeing a lot of our characters doing. Even someone like Dany, we're seeing Dany, you know, her husband and her child have to die so that she can move forward and, you know, focus on the next thing ahead. I thought it was interesting when the Great Jon stood up and he said, all the dragons are dead. And I thought, no, they're not.
Give it a chapter.
Yeah. And so that's also interesting, is like, even if these guys are kind of on the right track, they're still missing a key piece. They're still a little wrong. So that's like a hint of, you're not quite right. Things are not going to go the way you think they are. And that's also really interesting.
And how many times have we talked about adaptability being the key to survival in Westeros?
That's what we talked about with Tyrion last time, I think.
And Jon. And we said that that's why those two got along so well. But the character who didn't adapt is Ned, of course. He's the poster child for that in this series. And as many comparisons as there are in this chapter between Robb and Ned, Robb's adaptation, him moving, rolling with the punches here and the facts on the ground, that's much more of a Catelyn move.
Yeah.
Because she's smarter. She adapts more. She's less married to these principles and ideals, despite the way she sues for peace here.
I was going to say, she's afraid to do it here, but she knows that's what she needs to do, I think.
But the fact that Robb is doing this more than Ned did speaks to him also being her son.
Yes.
It's this Tully half of all of the Stark kids that help them survive longer than their father did.
Yes. I think you're totally right. Yeah, because all of them are learning to adapt in a way that Ned never did. So that's really interesting. Yeah, it was fun to see all this sort of wrap up. And I'm excited to keep seeing what happens with Catelyn. And I guess she and Robb are kind of our next victims of like, where do they go wrong? Why do they die? Because they're our next POV characters who die, right? Like no POV character dies in Clash of Kings. Like, people certainly die there, but no main characters.
I think you're right.
So I think like that's going to be our next, okay, when is it over for them? What's the turning point? And I know it's not that simple, and that's what we kind of spent this whole book realizing about Ned, but it's still interesting to think about. And I'm excited to compare her chapters to those of others and see what's different and go from there.
And in the same way, even though I feel like we've sort of wrapped up the philosophy of death discussion we've been having for more than a year here, I know in the next chapter, there's sort of going to be fence hopping in the other direction, where Dany kind of walks into the fire and it looks like it might be her death. And then she comes out of it and these dragon eggs have been born. So maybe that's her going the other way and becoming this force for life.
I see.
I don't know.
see. Yeah, sort of like a rebirth moment. Yeah,
Because
interesting.
that's always how it's been talked about with, the Phoenix rising from the Eldies.
Yeah,
all
yeah.
those sort of fire baked in metaphors about that. So I'm wondering how that'll play next week.
Which is counter to the King of Winter. This idea of ice and winter and death versus like fire and life. So that's going to be, fun to see.
One chapter left.
Crazy. Well, this has been so much fun. Thank you all so much for listening. Please let us know what you thought of this chapter, of the ideas we discussed. If you have anything to add, if you're on YouTube, you can comment below. Or if you're listening as a podcast, you can send us an email, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. We really appreciate you guys sticking through this series. We just have one episode left, and then of course our retrospective, but it's been really, really fun to do. We also forgot to mention, we are going to talk about season 1 of the show as an adaptation over on Patreon. So if you'd like to join our Patreon, it's $2 a month. You can support the show and get access to a whole back catalog of bonus episodes, plus the new episodes we're putting out every month. Our Breakfast Buffet series is over there, where we talk about sort of a roundup of things that we're interested in for that month. We also have our whole Fire and Blood series over there. If you're like, no, I want more chapter by chapter, honey, go to Fire and Blood. We got a lot over there for you, and a bunch of other things. So anyway, thank you all so much for listening, and we'll catch you on Tuesday with another brand new episode.